This is Fixing the Housing Crisis Beyond Supply. I'm Miriam Axel-Lute. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the co-CEO and editor-in-chief of Shelterforce, a publication focused on housing justice and community development. Before we jump in, I just want to set the context for today's conversation just a tiny bit. The need to support strategies that increase housing supply has gotten a lot of airtime in the past several years, and they're necessary, but not sufficient to address the housing crisis for a number of reasons, which I'm going to touch on extremely lightly, just to set the stage for why our focus is what it is today, though it could be a day's worth of conversation in itself. So why is supply not sufficient? First, there's an income floor below which housing cannot be affordable without subsidy, period. Second, housing is not a widget, and so simple supply and demand curves don't really work very well. As any real estate agent knows, it's about location, 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 and locations are all unique. They are not, can't be replaced for each other. Transaction costs are very high. Increases in supply do not always go to those who are going to use them. And the housing market is broken into many submarkets where changes in one don't have the same effect on the other. And finally, underlying talk of supply and demand is the fact that housing costs are very closely related to land costs, which are in fixed supply. Land is in fixed supply. And as long as landowners continue to be able to capture increases in land value for themselves, it's hard to keep housing prices from going up. In fact, a lot of the strategies you will hear today have something to do with changing the balance of land ownership or redirecting power and increments in land value away from private landlords or private landowners and toward the public good. In general, you can't talk about supply without talking about ownership. So I hope you're ready to go beyond supply with this wonderful panel. And I'm going to let them each introduce themselves when they speak first, starting with Julia Duranti-Martínez.
Thanks so much for joining today, and thanks to Next City and Shelterforce for hosting this. My name is Julia Duranti-Martínez, and I'm a senior program officer with LISC, with our National Community Research and Impact team. I'm based in New York City, and some folks may know LISC. We are a national nonprofit community development lender. So we're a community development financial institution, grant maker, capacity builder, convener, TA provider, and many other things, with 38 local offices across the country, as well as a pretty extensive rural network. So our team at LISC Community Research and Impact supports research and program design and implementation and systems change across our network of local offices and national programs. And I'm really excited for today's conversation focused on preservation strategies, especially as that's one area where our team has really focused over the last few years in supporting our local offices that are interested in strengthening their housing preservation infrastructure. To Miriam's point in her opening comments, obviously new production of housing is important, but we also need to invest in saving and improving what we have. And I think housing quality also is a big part of that conversation alongside long-term affordability. So some of the things that we've seen is, local offices that are pursuing everything from, standing up local housing trust funds to support groups with acquisition, supporting community development corporations and emerging developers, supporting home repair and addressing fractured title and heirs property issues, and efforts to expand tenant protections. All of this alongside supporting community ownership strategies like community land trusts, limited equity cooperatives, and resident-owned communities. So there's a lot to unpack within all of those different areas of work. But I think within that whole range of potential tools, there's been a lot of interest across different local offices in community opportunity to purchase policies and tenant opportunity to purchase policies, so COPA or TOPA, as they're often called, as policy tools that can really complement different kinds of preservation investments, and also as a way to combat rising investor ownership, which is a key part of some of these dynamics. So that is what has led us to write our recent series of briefs focused on COPA and TOPA policies, as well as a longer report that draws on LISC DC's 40 years of successfully implementing TOPA and from San Francisco's more recent COPA policy. So very excited to dig into some of our findings through the conversation today. So I think I'll leave it there and pass it to the next panelist.
Liz?
Hello, good morning and/or good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Great to see everyone. My name is Liz Ryan Murray. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Director of Strategic Campaigns at Public Advocates. Public Advocates is a legal and advocacy organization based in California, working on issues housing, education, climate, and transportation. I also am formerly the director of the Alliance for Housing Justice and still staff and work with AHJ, which is a national coalition focused on the federal response on housing, looking at everything from fair housing, tenants' rights, and social housing. I'm really thrilled about this conversation today. As Miriam said, I think there's been so much emphasis on production, and I would say a lot of emphasis on production without a lot of emphasis on production for whom. So really looking at both of these questions of what else do we need to do and how are we moving that production conversation in the right direction. Also, she mentioned commodification. A lot of the work that we do, that I get to do at the Alliance for Housing Justice and at Public Advocates, is working with our community partners and our organizing partners and our legal and advocacy partners towards what we keep being told by the folks that are most negatively impacted by our housing crisis. So we have to move beyond the system we have. It doesn't work. It wasn't designed to work for everyone. We need to move to a system that is decommodified, permanently affordable, for everyone. Make sure that everyone, especially people who can't afford market rent, have decent, safe, stable, affordable housing. A lot of times talk about social housing. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about how we get there and acknowledge it's not a single step. It wasn't a single step before 2 weeks ago, when the political landscape shifted, and it's not going to be a single step now. There are many pathways we have to walk down. So I'll talk about a little bit of those. And again, really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Roshan?
Hey, everybody. My name is Roshan Abraham. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I live in Queens, New York. I'm a freelance journalist. I write about housing for Next City as a housing correspondent and other publications. I'm glad to be here with you all today. The issue of supply is one I think about a lot. I think that when we talk about supply, we're often talking about the way that supply or limited supply offers more market power to landowners by limiting the amount of choices that consumers have. But we don't talk enough about the fact that there are many other points of leverage that tenants have and that they can use or they can produce by banding together. We don't talk enough about all the leverage that communities or the state and the government has in terms of having the power of the purse, and which it often doesn't use. And that includes federal housing tax credits, which are dispersed by states and where states can set conditions. And it includes state trust funds and other forms of states acting as lenders and having the power to set conditions on loans and financing. And I do think that the question of who we're producing housing for is a really important one. And so I hope I'll be able to chat a little bit later about not exactly a non-supply solution, but one that I think is more tailored toward building affordably and uses some level of state subsidies to build, which is the Mount Laurel model in New Jersey. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Roshan. And finally, we have Candice.
Good day or good morning to each of you whenever you're watching this. I am Candice Turner. I'm the Director of Homeownership with Maggie Walker Community Land Trust. We are located in Richmond, Virginia. And so as a community land trust, if you're not familiar, homeowners purchase what is called or referred to as the improvements, and they lease the land. And that process is an act of reciprocity. To keep homes in permanent perpetuity, affordable throughout the life of the ground lease, which is 99 years. And what I want to add to the conversation here is the importance of making housing successful, not just that person that we're housing in that moment, but that we're providing stability throughout the lifetime of that particular family or families to come. And the first way that we do that is to approach housing from a holistic perspective. I have worked with, of course, homeowners in my current position, but I've also worked with veterans. I've also worked with community members that were facing displacement from public housing. What I've noticed is that specifically when we think of a housing first model, that once somebody is stably housed, we see their mental health improve, we see their wellness improve, so their physical health improve. But we also acknowledge that there are comorbidities when it comes to housing instability. So when we think of ways to make great impact, not just today, but tomorrow, we have to use that holistic approach in thinking about what affordability is. At the end of the day, everybody is trying to afford wherever they live. So even when we think about the term housing affordability, we have to start with self and recognize and acknowledge all the things that have to be in place for someone to not just get housed, but to remain housed. I'm excited for our conversation today.
Thank you, everyone. I just want to say quickly, if you are not seeing things in the chat, if you have questions for our panelists, we are going to do Q&A at the end, and please enter that in the Q&A box separately from the chat so that it doesn't get lost in the chat and we make sure that we see your question. All right, but first we're going to have a few questions for our panelists to discuss, and we're going to start with something that is probably on everybody's mind, which is what can we do to address not only the existing housing crisis, but a likely increase in homelessness outside of or not relying on a hostile federal government and possibly even multiple hostile state governments. And we're going to start that with Liz.
That's a great question. And I would say the very first thing is don't give up before we've lost. I think there's an instinct sometimes, I certainly felt it, right, to just lie down on the floor. We can't do that. Last time we went through something like this 4 years ago, and through that administration, there were a lot of battles we won. So I want to make sure, that everybody keeps fighting. There are battles to be won. That is not to sugarcoat that it's going to be a really challenging environment, both in many states and at the federal government. And I would say that the big thing is local. As local as talking to your neighbors, talking to the folks who live around you, who shop with you. Find local organizing groups that can bring people together, bring together as tenants, as homeowners to do work in your own neighborhood. Mutual aid and service, especially as homelessness numbers may go up, and certainly the attitudes towards our homeless neighbors continue to toxify. Anything you can do to help those folks individually and at your own local level would be my response.
Thanks, Liz. Roshan?
Yeah, I think the question of homelessness is a really, really difficult one because the political landscape that we're currently in regarding homelessness was a bipartisan one, which makes it really challenging for people who want to, who care about the rights of people who've been forced out of the housing market. The you know, the Supreme Court case that was ruled over the summer that only came to the attention of the Supreme Court after, you know, both Republican and Democratic politicians, including Gavin Newsom, petitioned to the Supreme Court to take it up. And we see in every major city that there are attitudes about homelessness and strategies toward homelessness among those cities' mayors that they don't take first and foremost the health and safety of people who are unhoused for no reason of their own. There are sort of attempts at cleaning up and addressing perceived blight. So in terms of solutions, the first thing I would say is to resist the tendency to be reactive about this. I think like the most big city mayors addressing this are really acting from a place of the politics of grievance instead of like looking at solutions. I would say for tenants and renters, I think there's a big challenge with, you know, the tenant movements are not always seen as being in solidarity with movements of unhoused people. I think there's a lot of cross-class organizing that can happen. We're seeing that, you know, groups like the LA Tenant Union are doing a good job of putting this front and center as an idea in terms of, you know, organizing, you know, treating unhoused people as tenants. And I think that's a big deal because, you know, at the end of the day, politicians do not see unhoused people as their constituents. They, you know, even when they are outwardly trying to present solutions, there's like a level of pity there, or like they're sort of seen as like, you know, untoward subjects. And I think that we've seen really great organizing among unhoused people historically throughout the decades. There's been a lot of organizing. There's the National Homeless Union, which is seeing a resurgence recently. And we saw what I thought was a really great model in Sacramento last year, where there was a group of unhoused people who created an encampment on what was a city-owned lot that was supposed to be a space for homeless people, but there were bureaucratic issues getting in the way, and they essentially started an occupation, and the city reached a lease with them that guaranteed that everyone could stay on the land until they had permanent housing, and everyone agreed to that. And no one really wanted to live permanently, you know, outdoors. They all wanted permanent housing. Unfortunately, even though I think that was a great model, it could not withstand the politics both at the national and local level. The lease was dissolved over the summer, and they were swept from the encampment. But I still think it's a great example, and I'm working on a piece about this, so it's fresh on my mind of something we can look to in terms of, you know, cross-tenant and unhoused person solidarity in terms of like building strength to respect unhoused people and you know, find ways to give folks what they want and need, which is not a really complicated thing. It's, you know, the way to solve homelessness is with housing. And I'll just end that there because I think I've said a lot.
Thank you. Candice, you want to take on this question? Working with the hostile governments, or?
Sure. I think we have to get creative, number one. Number two, also acknowledge that everyone that's here, I'm assuming, is already doing the work. And as Liz said, don't stop and don't give up. There is, you know, a time, and I think a lot of people have already taken that time if needed already. And that time that I'm referencing is a moment of grief, right? To acknowledge, okay, the struggle is going to look a little bit different, may look a little different now. However, that doesn't negate the fact that, as Liz mentioned, that there's still work for us to do. I mentioned getting creative because here in Richmond, there's an organization, it's been around for a while, called Caritas, which goes from church to church or places of faith. And specifically during this time of year, people that are houseless are able to stay. Churches turn into somewhat of a shelter and a place of resources. And so we have people that are able to sign up that move from place to place until stable housing is able to be offered. I'm mentioning that because there's work that has to be done to put people in position of receiving housing. So we're talking about that housing affordability or the houselessness issue, but there are also things that need to be put in place to prepare someone even for that. When we talk about those comorbidities, severe mental illness can be a comorbidity when it comes to houselessness. And so how are we providing care in that regard as well, preparing someone for housing in any capacity? Also keeping in mind that people have housing trauma. I'll raise my hand, I am one of them. That people have housing trauma, whether it's spoken or unspoken. And so what are we putting in place to meet those needs as well? Again, all trauma isn't visible, right? Housing trauma is one of those things. So really thinking about what other organizations, what other providers can we bring into the fold to assist people and meet them exactly where they are. Also offering other pilot programs. We ran a lease to own program, which allowed a certain portion of money that people paid for rent to go into escrow if they decided to purchase. Is that a way that we can offer additional housing, right? So again, getting creative, using the resources that we have right now. There is a push nationally from a faith-based initiative because a lot of people have not returned. Yes, Betsy, I'm a social worker as well. Maybe you heard that. But there's a push because some churches have not returned after COVID. So what spaces in your community are not being utilized at all that could be used? And that's something to think about as well.
Candice, we have a question I just want to follow up really, really briefly. Can you
Sure.
give a definition of housing trauma? What you mean by that? Like, real short.
Yeah. It could be anything. When we think about from a home ownership perspective, we think about the mortgage bubble, we think about redlining, we think about all of the things that have made great impact, recognizing and acknowledging that a lot of times, whether it's people of color or people that are experiencing the social economic crisis, are leased away from home ownership, right? So thinking from a historical nature, that people have experienced displacement in a realm of possibilities. Some people have housing trauma when it comes to separation of families in public housing as well, right? So there's a plethora of ways that we can define housing trauma, but think of a break in how someone sees themselves as stable or what stability is. And that anything could trigger that, but it can leave someone stuck, meaning, and I think that I can never purchase a home, or I'll always be in a shelter, or a particular type of housing is something that I should not be able to have access to.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. And Julia.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes to all of these things. The only thing that I might add to what folks have already said is just, there's obviously going to be a need for rapid response organizing and for emergency kinds of organizing. And I think ways and, legal defense, like all of those kinds of strategies. But something that, long predates our current moment and predates COVID, although it's certainly been exacerbated by the pandemic, is just the need to invest in the basic sort of capacity of community-based organizations. That includes, you know, community land trusts and cooperatives and other forms of kind of solidarity economy, but understanding all of this as rebuilding like our community controlled and local controlled infrastructure and institutions, who have always played a really important role in, you know, literally sustaining communities and meeting community needs, and are going to become especially important in the face of, you know, hostile governments and cuts to resources at the federal level that may, you know, filter down, and hostile state government policies as well. And I think, again, that's like everything from the sort of mutual aid, sort of really locally rooted kinds of work that Liz was speaking about, to investing, you know, in nonprofit organizations and their kind of capacity to continue delivering their services and doing their work, to the housing organizations that want to add like some sort of housing preservation or housing development work to what they're doing, you know, recognizing how much time it takes to build out that experience and how resource intensive it is. And then I think just the last thing I would say too, just like as a queer person, like one thing that I've found really helpful is regrounding in our movement histories and just what we can learn from the incredible work that queer and trans elders have done for generations in resisting, you know, hostile institutions and creating structures and practices around community care, and mutual aid, and building organizations to reflect that. All of that also needs to be shored up, especially given that, you know, LGBTQ plus folks are among the many communities that are potentially going to be most targeted by all of this work. And just, I think in general, reconnecting with those histories and practices brings, I think, a lot of sustenance to a time that can otherwise feel, to what folks have been saying, just like it's really hard to imagine a path forward and what action might look like.
Amen to that. Thank you. And I just want to note that we, and speaking of creativity, Shelterforce is putting out a piece either today or tomorrow about folks in Florida who've been working on how to keep doing tenant organizing in the face of state preemption on the kinds of protections they'd been working on before. So there's some history, some recent history of folks trying to figure this out. And we're going to keep doing it going forward. And so let's move on to some more depth on the strategies that we've been talking about. Can we each talk about one concrete, promising strategy that would help with addressing our housing crisis? And we're going to start this time with Roshan.
Sorry, my phone's going to keep falling because I have like a very precarious situation here. Thank you for the grace. Yeah, strategies. I mean, one thing that I mentioned really briefly at the top, and I don't know if Liz might go more into this, but you know, as I alluded to, states have the ability to set conditions on federal money that comes their way, including for the low-income housing tax credit, which is the main way that this is the main way that affordable housing is funded in the United States. So we had reported on that at Next City a few weeks ago. But that, you know, that's somewhere where like state level advocacy can lead to deeper affordability and longer affordability periods instead of the minimum 30 years. The other thing that I would like to lift up is, you know, when we're talking about again, as I said earlier, when we're talking about supply and we're talking about, you know, where that supply is targeted, like what affordability levels. And I think that one really good model that gets at this is in New Jersey. There's they have what are called Mount Laurel requirements, which stem from a 50-year-old civil rights lawsuit. A Black woman who had filed this class action lawsuit on behalf of her community because their homes were being destroyed, and the new zoning that was being put in place in their community just did not allow for multifamily housing at all. So this led to a lawsuit and 50 years of back and forth lawsuits. And now New Jersey has this legal framework where basically every region has to produce their fair share of affordable housing, and the income levels are based on the jobs numbers for those regions, and the housing is subsidized by the federal low-income housing tax credits I mentioned earlier, but also development taxes. New development gets like a small tax. I think it's like 1%, and that goes to like a state housing trust fund. Obviously, whenever there's development taxes, developers claim that it's going to reduce the amount of housing production. There's no evidence that has happened in this case. And it has, it's developed a lot of housing. I think it's the amount of housing it's developed has increased a lot in the past like 7 years, just because the legal framework has kept getting stronger with additional lawsuits and back and forth lawsuits. So I think it's something to look at, and it can be reproduced. It would be hard to reproduce it through the judicial branch, but I think that legislatively on a state level or community level, it can be reproduced. And I think what's good about it is that it really a lot even though communities can still have input on the housing that's getting built, they can't really just turn down housing out of hand. They have to meet this requirement, these affordability requirements. So I think it's a really good model that I think contrasts a bit with the sort of market rate is the only type of housing that matters, and somehow that's the cheapest way of producing housing, which I don't really think it necessarily is when you're thinking about the lowest income renters. So yeah, I guess I'll end it there.
Great. And I just want to throw out very quickly, Massachusetts has something a little similar that they did legislatively, 40B, and recently some studies have found that actually meaningfully reduced segregation, which is something that has felt very sticky and hard to achieve. And so it has many, many benefits approaching fair share housing that way. So I'm going to turn it to Candice now to talk just a little bit more about CLTs.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, CLTs really are an act of reciprocity, whereas the program is bringing someone in to home ownership, and then in turn, that person, if they do decide to sell, is bringing someone else in. So they're pulling someone else in that has the same or meets the same qualifications. In the CLT, we use the HUD 80% AMI, average median income. For our program, most of our buyers are truthfully in the 60 AMI scenario. And I think someone mentioned, just circling back around to that housing trauma, it's very important to keep in mind that legacy is something we have to think about when we're thinking about stability, right? Like, the idea is not that we house someone, whether that is through home ownership or through apartment living or wherever. And I shouldn't say through apartment living, because an apartment is a home as well. But whichever route that someone is housed, we want to do it in a way that is not a Band-Aid on a situation that needs surgery. What do I mean? I mean, we want to make sure that we're offering opportunities that don't allow people to recycle back through the system. And so in our desire to house someone or to provide an opportunity, it's increasingly important that we keep the mission in mind and not just we're in crisis mode, because crisis sometimes gives way to Band-Aid and not surgery. A CLT is one solution to that in the sense that the home can be passed down as a legacy asset. I'm thinking about our namesake Maggie L. Walker, Magdalena Walker, who was born in Richmond, first Black woman to preside over a bank. I really believe that there were tables that needed to be created if there was not a seat at the table. And so when we think about community land trust and when we think about a solution to this, community land trusts offer that legacy opportunity. But I also want to mention this very quickly, something that Julia said earlier in terms of finding the people that are already doing the work in the community that often go without assistance. They're doing it and they are in those communities. How do we link to people that are already in the community? And that's one of the things that we do at MWCLT is if there's a community that has an opportunity for us to build, it is going into the community and finding those organizations that are doing the work and asking what those needs are. Asking, what does housing affordability look like in this community? What does the ideal home look like? What are the needs? And again, that's even outside of housing. We can't talk about housing without talking about food insecurity. We can't talk about housing without talking about other supports that are needed. And so that is something that I want to bring to the table as well when we're talking about strategy. Let's not exclude the big picture of it all. Stability is inclusive of health, of course, that wealth piece, but also the mental wellness part. So bringing in those other providers that can assist with that is important as well.
Great. Julia, you want to?
I'll try to be fast because I know we have one more question. I think it's, just to sort of what Liz was saying earlier, none of this is just one tool, even if we're just looking at preservation, like there's no one quick fix, but I think like one policy that has been gaining a lot of momentum over the last few years is opportunity to purchase policies. So COPA or TOPA, community opportunity to purchase, tenant opportunity to purchase. And there's different ways of structuring these policies, but basically the idea, is to give either tenants or a community-based partner a fair shot at buying rental buildings when they go up for sale, which is often, an extremely destabilizing moment for tenants and for any kind of organizing work that may be happening, because then there's an ownership change. They have to sort of start over from scratch when it comes to, improving building conditions or limiting rent hikes, things like that. And so, the best known example is, of course, Washington, D.C.'s TOPA policy. It's been in place for over 40 years, has had a lot of success, at preserving affordability, but also leading to significant housing upgrades and repairs in about 12% of the district's multifamily housing stock, which is pretty tremendous, given that most places don't, outside of code enforcement, there's not like a way to, there's no real mandates around owners improving their properties. So it can lead to real improvement for tenants, both in terms of quality and in terms of affordability, and just having a say, if tenants are not interested in forming a co-op and buying their building themselves, and having a say in who the future owner is going to be. And that can, very easily be a community land trust, for example, or similar kind of community-based nonprofits. There's a, way that these strategies can be used to support CLTs in sort of growing and scaling their work and supporting cooperatives as well. And I think the last thing just to note about these is that like a policy by itself without investments in tenant organizing, technical and legal assistance to groups, and in the capacity of community-based organizations to do this work, and especially for fast and flexible acquisition financing, so that groups, it's like if you have a right to put in an offer on a building but no money to use, it's not that helpful. And so being able to pair these kinds of like TOPA or COPA policies with investments in local preservation programs and infrastructure has been something that just over and over folks in communities who have COPA or TOPA emphasize. And I think there's a flip side of that too, right? Which is, you know, if you're working in a state that maybe would preempt something like a local right of first refusal or COPA or TOPA policy, there are still ways to get similar outcomes by investing in those kinds of preservation programs and tenant organizing. And I think too, the fact that there has been so just an incredible amount of tenant organizing nationally in different communities, including in cities and like smaller cities and towns that have not historically had a super strong tenant movement is a real sign of encouragement. And just the number of groups who are able to organize and actually, you know, acquire their first properties during the pandemic, like during this time of incredible strain on communities. You look at examples like in Communities Unidas in the Twin Cities or Buena Vista Co-op in DC, some of the New York City-based CLTs and co-op efforts, California. All of that are things that can, you know, be built on and scaled and sort of channeled for all of this work. So I think if we're trying to think about potential opportunities and like windows as we look towards the future, I think those are some of the things to focus on.
Great. All right, Liz, I'm going to have you go, and then we're going to move into audience Q&A because I want to make sure to get to at least some of these questions. If you have others, them in the Q&A function. Thank you.
Right. I will also try to be quick. Roshan talked a little bit about what I want to highlight, which is the opportunity to shape the low-income housing tax credit in individual states. So as Roshan mentioned, it is the largest, by far, source of funding for construction and rehab of affordable housing. It's 13-some billion a year that comes from the federal government, and most states also have their own allocations. It was passed, you know, it was established in 1986, I believe, and that's not a surprise. It was passed to replace public housing. The racialized disinvestment from public housing went hand in hand with what LIHTC, which is what we call low-income housing tax credits, is a tax credit program. It is a corporate tax giveaway with a trade-off of some affordable housing. It would be great if someday we could get to a point where we're doing more direct funding for CLTs and TOPA programs and other forms of decommodified permanent affordable housing. But for now, LIHTC is what we have. It's huge. It is in, I believe, it's well over 90% of every affordable construction project that's out there has some LIHTC in it, one way or another. And the federal government, again, it tells you a little bit about the priority of this. This is an IRS program. This comes from the Treasury. This is not a HUD program. But it does not contain a whole lot of rules other than the tax rules, right? But for tenant protections at the federal level, it's quite skimpy. There are, you know, very limited affordability window federally, 30 years. After that, the building can convert to market rate, which generally means mass displacement. Rents are set program-wide at area median income, not at the family's income. So that often leads to pretty large rent burden in LIHTC buildings. Very ill-defined just cause eviction protections at the federal level. There are no real rent caps. There's an extremely complicated and formula on how HUD actually sets rents. If we talked about all the details of LIHTC, we would be here until next year. It is an I would actually knock it for that. It's an extraordinarily complex program as well. No community control or tenant control. But the good news is, while the federal government, those are all floors. They are not ceilings. And states, every state and a couple of cities around the country get their allocation of credits from the federal government and can set their own rules. and set their own rules for the needs that they have in their own communities. As Julia was talking about, right? Or I think Miriam at the beginning, every community is different. Every geography is different. Every housing crisis looks different. So states and these cities have the opportunity through a program, through something called the QAP, the Qualified Allocation Plan, to set their own rules. It's a real opportunity for organizing because there are great examples. I'm going to shove some of these in here of where states have really moved the LIHTC program to much more stability, much more tenant focused. California has a 55-year affordability ceiling, which is better than 30, but Vermont has 99 years. The ground leases like Candice was talking about for CLTs. There are a bunch of cities, states that set rent caps at 5 or lower percent. Just cause eviction protections that are much better, much more protective of tenants in that process. It's a I shouldn't even say slightly, it's a bureaucratic process, right? Most of these rules are set at the community development departments. In California here, it's the tax credit allocation committee, but there are rules about, being open and taking comment, and some states do this every year. There's a real opportunity, as I was talking about, to lay down more bricks on this pathway towards true, sustainable, affordable, habitable housing for folks, and using the money we have. And this is the big money. I will stop there because I know we're a little over time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. There's so much that folks want to talk about, and I'm sad that we're not going to get to all these comments, but I'm going to start with one topic that has come up twice so that we have a little efficiency there, and that is to talk about rural areas. So we have some questions about how do we encourage small towns, rural counties to think of themselves as places where they want to create housing and to engage in creating housing, perhaps beyond just using tax credits? And also, are there opportunity to purchase act versions that rural communities could see themselves in a way that they don't in DC? And one thing I will throw out there is that there is opportunity to purchase act stuff around mobile home communities in Colorado, which is one place to start. Obviously, that's not all the housing in rural areas, but it is one piece of the puzzle. But I'm going to turn that over to the panelists.
Since you mentioned manufactured home park communities, I would just add, my understanding is New Hampshire and Minnesota have similar right of first refusal policies for manufactured home parks, but also looking at the work that Resident Communities USA has done. Rock USA is also super helpful. And then the handful of Maryland jurisdictions that also have right of first refusal and TOPA policies. Some have been in place since around the same time as DC's, and others are more recent. They all work a little bit differently, but those might also be just helpful sort of other examples to learn from.
I will say not every problem is a nail for my particular hammer, but I will say there are some states who have included in particular extra points on applications for LIHTC for incorporating a TOPA and COPA, which is a way to do that statewide. The biggest issue is, of course, a big issue is getting the money to purchase. But I think that's a real opportunity. Then also working with state, local, county, and federal on directing of funds, right? Because I think there tends to be lip service to rural, sometimes more than actual services, and being able to sort of move some of that attention, some of that money can be really helpful. Not that it's easy, but it's worth fighting for.
Great. If you have more rural thoughts, you can fold it into this next question, but I just wanted to bring up a couple folks are asking about messaging and about coordinating. So in this political time, how do we work together as a housing movement to not be like, that's a little bit over here and a little bit over there, and our priorities are all different? What do you see as the potential for being a little more unified in our approach and messaging in a way that reaches a wider range of folks, including people who may not yet be housing insecure?
I'm going to say this in a hopefully very C3 way. I believe one of the things that we should all be echoing and telling the story and yelling the story of is a lot of this election was about people not feeling like they were being heard on affordability, on the costs of their daily life. And the biggest cost in just about everybody's daily life is housing. The rent is too high, mortgage is too high, taxes are too high. And it led, and they're seeing it in their neighborhoods, and they're feeling it themselves and their kids and I think that's the lesson we have to keep hammering. I think there's a real danger, and I'm seeing it, of people taking lessons from the election. It's like, oh, we need to shift right. Oh, we need to stop talking about the most vulnerable people. And that is, that is just frankly the wrong lesson, and wrong from what we learned of who stayed home and who made decisions the way they did. And it was about what they could afford. And we have got to address the housing crisis. And I would say, I don't know, I didn't exactly see the thing, but I think it's okay to some extent to let many flowers bloom on solutions. CLTs are a solution, and Topacopa is a solution, and moving money is a solution, and homeless services is a solution, and decriminalizing houselessness is a solution. I don't think that's always necessarily bad, as long as we're coming back to this message of the dignity of all of our neighbors.
Anyone else want to take that and also mention there's interest in translocal organizing and coordinating around these topics?
I think Liz hit the nail on the head. The common thread in all of this is that there is a need and we have to meet that need. I think what happens a lot of times is, for some, home ownership is cheaper than renting. But we also have to acknowledge that some people may not be at a place of getting a mortgage. And then there are also a group of people that aren't at a place where they can even rent at certain housing communities because of the requirements that might have. So what we all do need to come together, as Liz mentioned, because the common denominator here is instability, right? Like housing instability. I think, the other piece of that is CLTs, as Liz mentioned, are a solution. It's not the solution for everybody. And so we want to get all of the players at the table, wherever it is that you live. If there's a housing authority, if there is, a CLT, whoever the players are, it's really important at this crucial time of transition that we get everybody together to have the conversation, not just about who's going to get the grant funding per se, but how do we address this problem together? It is the only way we're going to solve it, right? And we can't continue to walk around the elephant in the room as if it doesn't exist. It's here and it's taking up space, right? So the only way to address that is one conversation at a time with action. When we think about the rural areas, I think part of that is, at least here in Richmond, we have some of the mobile communities that have been taken on by some of our smaller development organizations in the area. And so how do we give some of those other developers a chance or a seat at the table as well? They may not be able to develop 10 properties, but maybe they can do 1 or 2. How are we bringing other people and other resources into the room that weren't considered? I really think another way of looking at this is kind of like, and I think an analogy, so bear with me, but it's kind of like, Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. She had the ability to go home, but she had to meet people along the way to get there. So it can't just be on one organization or one path, as Liz mentioned, to get somewhere. It's going to take all of us in order to get where we need to get to. I'll leave it there.
Great. We have so little time, so I'm just going to throw out here, and this is going to be kind of a yes, that's a part of it, but the many flowers bloom phrase from Liz, I'm just noting here in our questions, we have questions about a number of other solutions that we haven't managed to touch on today, including supporting smaller property owners who want to keep rents affordable but need some financial support, inclusionary zoning, rent restrictions. So throwing those out there, if there are any of them that you want to very quickly address or sort of talk about this general idea of how we coordinate all these multiple solutions. And I want to let Roshan jump in because he hasn't yet in this round, but then if
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. Yeah, in terms of rent restrictions. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely rent restrictions are like something that, as we said, they can be sort of like put onto state funding, as a condition of state funding, or even federal funding that goes through the state. There's ballot measures. There's one that I think passed in the Twin Cities recently. And I think that, obviously there's always like a lot of political pushback with rent restrictions. And as someone brought up, smaller property owners don't always have there are certainly cases where there are units that where the rent rolls are not matching maintenance need. And I think it is sort of like incumbent on states to sort of provide more support and sort of like do audits to like figure out where that is happening, where the rent rolls are not matching maintenance needs, and to provide subsidies through one of the channels that we've talked about here.
one more minute.
Sorry.
More minute.
That's about all. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I know Liz wanted to jump in. Lightning round, real fast.
We need rent control because all of the costs are real, but they shouldn't be borne by the poorest and lowest income folks who are trying to keep a roof over their heads. That said, I agree on the issue of operating costs. As Miriam said, right from the very first sentence that we got on here, we need government help with this. If we're going to house everybody, the private market isn't going to do it. So big fan of that as well.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. This webinar has been recorded. It will be on Next City's website, and we will post it as well. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions, so many good questions, but this conversation will keep going in both Next City and Shelterforce, I am sure.